Before the Republic was even an idea, the Hutts began carving out a chunk of the galaxy to call their own, and their sovereign territory, Hutt space, persisted even after the Republic's fall. No matter the era, there was always Hutt space, the polluted realm of the galaxy's greatest criminal cartel. The Hutts saw themselves as gods, and within their domain they acted like it, ordering everything as they saw fit. But the Hutts weren't the only species in Hutt space. Indeed, this vast swath of the rim contained thousands of inhabited worlds, many of which had their own indigenous sentient races. But what happened to those species unfortunate enough to live in Hutt space? In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The most common fate for non-Hutt species in Hutt space was, unfortunately, slavery. Back when the Hutts ruled an empire, they enslaved pretty much everyone they encountered. Most of the species enslaved by the Hutts back then never escaped servitude. The only exceptions were those species the Hutts exterminated. Many of these species were legally enslaved in totality, meaning that every member of that species was enslaved unless explicitly freed under Hutt law. The most prominent examples of this were the peoples of the Ciklata cluster, who the Hutts contractually enslaved for 25,000 years before the Clone Wars. These species, the Klatunians, the Nikto, and the Vodrins, were originally enslaved to serve as slave soldiers in the Hutt Empire's war with Zim the Despot. But after Zim's defeat, they were retrained by the Hutts as a permanent standing army. Even after the Hutt Empire ceased to exist and the Hutts generally gave up on war and conquest, the Nikto, Klatunians, and Vodren usually served as soldiers, guards, or in some related capacity for their Hutt overlords. The homeworlds of these species, along with the whole Ciklata cluster, were closed to outsiders by Hutt decree, allowing the Hutts to indoctrinate the peoples of Ciklata into seeing them as gods. As a result, many members of these species couldn't even conceive of freedom from Hutt rule. Other slave races in Hutt space included the Geruans, who were typically used as fighters, assassins, or attendants. The Scoops, a mutant species frequently used for manual labor, the Talnami, who openly hated their Hutt overlords but were never able to organize a successful rebellion, and the historically acquiescent Xissians. Some of these slave races were treated better than others. The Xissians, for example, were decently prosperous after 25,000 years of Hutt servitude. The Elosians were even allowed their own small fiefdom of mid-rim agricultural worlds along the Elosian Spur, despite being a slave species and not a client species. All of the aforementioned slave races were allowed to keep their homeworlds, at least to some extent, though only because it was too much of a pain for the Hutts to keep them all under direct control. The Hutts preferred to rule these worlds through soft power and economic dependency, which allowed them to continually prey on their population whenever they wanted more slaves. Don't mistake that for kindness though. The Hutts were brutal to all of their slaves, even if they took the path of least resistance when it came to their homeworld sometimes. Not every non-Hutt species in Hutt space was enslaved, however. Many others were client races, vassals of the Hutts that were allowed full self-rule. These species ruled their own swaths of territory within Hutt space, but they ultimately swore allegiance to Nal Hutta, which exacted regular tribute. Essentially, these species had a feudal relationship with the Hutt Council. This relationship protected Hutt client species from being enslaved, though it didn't stop individuals from these species from ending up on the auction block now and again. The first Hutt client race was the Talander Till, distant relatives of the Hutts who evolved on the same homeworld. The Talander Till worked with the Hutts to build their empire, and when Hutt society restructured, the Talander Till followed suit, working with various Hutt clans as part of their criminal schemes. The Vipits of Ali had a similar role in Hutt affairs, regularly acting as the lawyers of the Hutt cartel and the Hutt Empire before it. Hutt-affiliated Vipit lawyers were notorious for being slimy, both literally, since they were snail-like, and figuratively. The most notorious example of this was the acquisition of Nal Hutta, then known as Evokar from the native Evokai, who Vipit lawyers swindled into gradually selling off their entire planet to the Hutts. Some Hutt client species had already developed their own advanced interstellar civilizations by the time the Hutts got to them, and the Hutts just found it easier to let them keep their territories in exchange for tribute. This was the case for the Yahk-Tosh, a species related to the Hutts that ruled the southern tip of Hutt space, from their homeworld of Zolu down to the Pando Spur. The Toydarians were a similar case, ruling their homeworld and a few neighbouring systems in the Hutt's mid-rim territories. Other Hutt client species included the Siberians of Siberia, the Tysklans of Tysk, and the Nimbanels of Nimban, the latter of whom were a particularly interesting case. In the distant past, Nimban was a member of the Republic, but the Nimbanels actually ended up leaving the Republic to become Hutt vassals. Because of this, they were among the best treated species in Hutt space, with the Hutts typically favouring Nimbanel subordinates. Many Nimbanels served as personal representatives for powerful Hutt leaders, given permission to make decisions in their masters' names. Other Nimbanels served alongside the Vipits as lawyers for the Hutt cartel, and they were every bit as figuratively slimy, if not literally slimy, as their snail-like counterparts. One team of Hutt contracted Nimbanel lawyers once talked an entire species into mass suicide as part of a Hutt ploy to take over Boz Pity. The third and final category of species in Hutt space were the rebels, those who resisted or somehow escaped Hutt rule. During the time of the Hutt Empire, slave species that rebelled were punished with genocide, and we know of a few species that met with this fate, most notably the Morolans and the former inhabitants of Usk. A number of desolate worlds in eastern Hutt space, in the region known as the Cairns, appear to have once hosted other civilizations, indigenous or otherwise, that the Hutts had exterminated, the records of which were lost to time. These included the Emhana and the Sakar. The Hulun, whose planet the Hutts claimed as a nature preserve, were all driven from their homes and tortured to death if they tried to return. The Langunans, a former slave species that rebelled against Hutt rule, were stripped of all technology and hunted for sport by Hutts on safari. There were also the unfortunate Evokai, whose homeworld was stolen and settled by the Hutts. When they tried to resist the terraforming of their home, they were enslaved and deported to the planet's largest moon, Nar Shaddaa, where they were put to work building the vertical city. Once the city was complete, the Evokai were banished to Nar Shaddaa's Undercity, where they suffered mutation and eventually extinction due to exposure to toxic waste. But not all the species that resisted the Hutts failed in their efforts. A select few species were actually successful in staving off Hutt control or escaping it altogether. The Ganathans, a near-human species whose homeworld was shrouded within the Yahk-Tosh Nebula, were never discovered or conquered by the Hutts, allowing them to retain their independence. The Sakians, meanwhile, successfully resisted every attempt to conquer their homeworld and its colonies, despite their location right in the middle of the old Hutt Empire. The Hutts eventually managed to achieve a sort of neo-colonialism over the Sakians, making them economically dependent on Nal Hutta, but the Sakians still retained de jure independence from Hutt rule. Only one species in Hutt space is known to have maintained de facto independence from the Hutts, however, the Ryleb, who refused to give the Hutts any quarter on their isolated homeworld. The Ryleb homeworld became an enclave in Hutt space, kept afloat by a steady stream of supplies shipped in from the Unagrin outside of Hutt space. The Ryleb not only maintained fierce legal independence from Hutt space, but they also made sure that the Hutts didn't get a single credit out of their homeworld. For their part, the Hutts, after millennia of failed attempts to conquer the Ryleb in one way or another, preferred to just pretend the Ryleb didn't exist. And with that, the Ryleb might just win the title of the most base species in the Star Wars universe. But what do you think? Which of these species is your favorite? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.